Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with a discussion about the High Elves in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires and the critical issues that they currently have in their campaigns. Making this video to highlight these issues. I've done various videos on the subject, but I'm just looking to highlight this for Creative Assembly, and I'll provide this feedback directly to them. Whether or not they listen to it, that's up to them, but just bring up these issues as I see them. Now, one of the things they have mentioned in their video is that they're going to provide unique mechanics for Tyrion and Teclis. And that is absolutely one of the critical issues for the High Elves right now, because both Teclis and Tyrion have issues in their campaigns due to their lack of mechanics, in particular Teclis. I would say that it's not just an issue of mechanics, however, it's also a question of victory conditions. So, with regards to High Elf and Legendary Lords, getting new mechanics for Teclis and Tyrion, all well and great. Getting the racial rework tech update, all well and good. But in general, I would say High Elves do need better victory conditions. And it's not just the High Elves. A lot of races do need better victory conditions. Teclis in particular. I think with Teclis, he should have like a world wandering mechanic, because that's what he does in the lore. But unlike Oxyatl, who's focused on military missions, maybe Teclis could be better focused on diplomacy. Just a perspective on that. But another thing to mention about existing lords of the High Elves, they should look to rebalance and fix some of the issues that Alariel and Elfarion have. So Alariel's mechanic of defending Ulthuan and how that plays out in a campaign, as well as Elfarion's need to capture lords in battle in order to make his entire campaign work. Because it just forces you to fight a lot of battles manually, and it's a particular problem for multiplayer campaigns because no one wants to play with an Elfarion, because you're not going to get prisoners if you auto-resolve, but no one in a multiplayer campaign in particular is going to want to wait for you to just fight those battles manually. So that is one thing I would like to see improved for Elfarion, and I would like fixes for Alariel, but victory conditions, dynamics, rebalancing, fixes for those campaigns. That's what I consider a critical issue. They have mentioned Tyrion, they have mentioned Teclis. It doesn't need to be an overhaul of Alariel's mechanics or Elfarion's, just fixes, balance changes, pacing issues with those mechanics. Now, a second critical issue has to do with confederations. The way confederations work for the High Elves right now is a bit awkward, and I'm not quite 100% certain on how they do function at the moment. The best I can tell is that it's based on territory you control in Ulthuan, but I'm not certain on that. Why I have noticed at the moment is that confederations are much easier to pull off if you do have a lot of territory in Ulthuan, and Ulthuan is extremely valuable. They have mentioned they are going to give High Elves a mechanic to confederate similar to the Great Book of Grudges, so that's another critical issue that's going to be fixed. But it does bring up the question of minor High Elven factions, but yes, it's good that CA is giving us that mechanic. I think it makes perfect sense for the High Elves more ways than one. I wonder how it's going to work. Is it going to be a case like Dwarves where you're playing any of the Legendary Lords and you can confederate any of the others? Or is it going to be a case with similar perhaps to what they've just done for the Tomb Kings, where you can only confederate certain Legendary Lords, depending on who you're playing? Personally, I prefer more along the lines of the Dwarves, though maybe some exclusion, like if you confederate one Lord, you can't get another. Depends, but we'll see what Creative Assembly does on that subject. The third critical issue has to do with their tech tree. Right now, the High Elven tech tree is not really great. It's very outdated. It requires different buildings in order to make, and you're realistically only going to get those buildings to unlock research. For instance, if you're playing a campaign as Tyrion, you would only get the Archive, which is a tier 3 mage building. You'd only get it to unlock military advancements 2 in order to get light FLMR armor and precise fletching. Because you already start with the mage, so getting a building that just allows you to recruit mages but doesn't increase capacity is not really worth it. So tech tree in general could use an overhaul. The fact that things like cultural advancements and trade advancements are locked until much later on in a campaign, especially cultural advancements, is an issue. But I think in general, we can expect Creative Assembly to improve the technology tree, overhaul them. They've done a good job with respect to the Lizardmen. And by the way, speaking about reworks, just in general, if you look at Lizardmen, what did they change for Lizardmen? They changed the technology tree, they changed certain buildings, right? Well, that's not at all dissimilar from what they did with Greenskins, at least for the race, not individual characters. Sure, they changed things for Warzag, they changed things for Skarsnik, but in terms of the race itself, it's not dissimilar. When we look at Empire, what did they change for Empires? Buildings and Imperial Authority, so just two big changes. So that's one of the things I would like to mention with regards to reworks. I mean, obviously we got Guild, we got Karl Franz, pretty big deal, reworking those mechanics, but in terms of racial changes, that's what they changed with the Empire. Wars got a lot more, to be sure, but not all reworks are equal from that perspective. So, third critical issue, tech tree. The fourth one has to do with the entire system of influence, and I had hoped that they would talk about this, but right now, the way it works in a High Elven campaign is you either get these lords that have negative traits, or at most useless traits that don't have an impact whatsoever, in the sense that you can get ridiculed, which, what do you care about that, right? Because you can always use another lord to recruit that, so essentially getting a ridiculed archmage is a good way to go for it. But you either get negative traits or get positive traits. There's two problems with this. One, the positive traits are very expensive from an influence perspective. The way you gain influence, you'll gain a lot of it later on in a campaign, but early on in a campaign it is extremely limited. So this pushes players down the path of, okay, some legendary lords just have a much better situation with influence. Alifanar, for instance, Alariel has a much better situation with influence. The Elfarian kind of to a degree, but not as much. But still, some have, some don't. Balancing issue between legendary lords on that subject. So it is a situation where it is annoying early on, but later on you have as much to spend as you can. But beyond that, some of these positive traits are just completely game-breaking, especially if you're using the load save character system. The reason behind that is if we look at an Administrator Archmage reduces construction costs by 15% and construction time by 20%, and this stacks. I cannot stress enough how major of a buff getting a bunch of these Administrator Archmages are, because it's instant construction and free construction. That's a huge level of power to use in a campaign. And even if you're not using load save character system, it's basically heavily encouraged for you to eventually get administrators anyway in a High Elven campaign. So some issues with respect to that, some significant issues with the influence system and the unique traits to High Elves. I think they've done a pretty good job with 6.3 at overhauling the generic traits and certain racial traits. Like I look at Bretonia, for instance, that's a much better situation. But I do think that High Elves do need a trait overhaul. I think they need an overhaul with influence, and they need an overhaul with lords and heroes and how that entire system works. I don't mind the idea of a system where you can select traits or you can get better traits, sure, but there should be a limit to the level of power. And I also think that having influence with diplomacy, the whole tab over here, the UI, the way it functions, it feels very lackluster. So that is a very critical issue. The entire influence system, how you gain it, how you spend it, what you're spending it on. If there is one thing I would say about the High Elves, is they start in a kind of okay position early on, because spearmen and archers are capable of dealing with a lot of things, but they become an absolutely ridiculous race in the campaign later on. Plenty of races do so, but I think like instant and free construction is just completely bananas, as is just the ability of manipulating things from a diplomatic standpoint to the point that you don't even have to fight any wars if you don't want to. So yeah, some rebalancing is in order there. The final critical issue that I would like to talk about with the High Elves is their entire building situation. This is one of the things I do expect them to update on, but basically, a lot of the things that are available early on are pretty much what you're going to use for the majority of the campaign when it matters. So, in essence, if you're playing a High Elf campaign, you're realistically in every single one of them, except Alifanar to an extent, and only for his own army, you're just going to be spamming spearmen and archers. Some people even argue, forget light armor, just go with regular archers, because it's more cost effective. That's the kind of discussions we have with High Elves. Things like Illyrian Reavers, Silverhelms, Shadow Warriors a lot, they're in Seaguard. They are a very questionable value. One of the problems they have is with regards to artillery, because you only have one artillery piece at tier 3. Hopefully Skycutters will have Siege Attacker and it will be a flying artillery option. We'll find out about that, how that works out, but yeah, Skycutters might just be a tier 4 Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower that's flying. And that could give High Elves a significant artillery advantage. But beyond the unit situation, because you have a lot of awesome units, but you never have an incentive to use them in a campaign when, again, it matters, when the stakes are high. There are bigger problems with regards to endgame and Total War, but that's one of the issues. The other issue is the fact that High Elves have a lot of buildings to construct. You have a growth building, you have an economic building, you have a control building. It also gives you money, and your economy is dependent on the level of control in a province, if we look at the Elven Craftsmen. Limited early on, ridiculous later on. You have the Elven Gardens, the Elven Court, the Elven Embassy, just too many things put together. Some of these effects could just be added on a single building, like merging Elven Embassy and Elven Court could be a thing. Maybe removing some of the effects, maybe moving the noble from the Elven Embassy to the barracks chain, for instance. Just an idea on that subject. But yes, the way the dynamic of buildings work. Also, with regards to heroes, you have such severe limitations in terms of recruiting heroes, because with the exception of getting a noble at tier 2 and a mage at tier 3, all your heroes require tier 4 in order to recruit, if you're looking at handmaidens and lore masters, or to increase capacity, which is not a great thing. This is one of the things that I do expect Creative Assembly to improve on, but again, it's just that kind of situation, especially because if we look at victory conditions, which do increase hero capacity, you play a campaign with very limited heroes, with a lot of archers and spearmen. It does get tiring, especially on replays, and then you just get 10 heroes all at once. You know, you complete your victory conditions, you get to tier 4 in this element, you're over a dozen heroes instantly. That is not a great dynamic in a campaign. Like, I personally dislike having a situation where I'm just recruiting a dozen heroes all at once, especially when I don't care about them. One of the things I like about the dwarves, one of the things I like about Nurgle, one of the things I like about a lot of races is that I can get every hero type early on, so I have those choices to make. Like, do I get a warrior priest early on in an Empire campaign? Do I get an engineer? Especially important because the Empire research tree allows you to get one extra hero capacity. So what are you going to focus on? What's more important for you in the campaign? Sure, Empire has some issues, infantry issues mainly. But that is one aspect that I really like about the Empire, and I would like to see it spread out some more. Not just a completely ridiculous, overwhelming amount of heroes. It does tie in together with the balancing situation, because let's just put it like that. Handmaidens are freaking ridiculous. They give you diplomatic relations with every faction, they give you trade tariffs, and they give you influence, and also control in every province. So in that way, Alariel, who can recruit handmaidens, has a hero capacity faction-wide, lore effect situation with handmaidens. Global recruitment of handmaidens is just so far ahead of everyone else in terms of empire building, it's not even funny. Now, I think it makes sense for her to have a handmaiden benefit, but it shouldn't be a case of like, there is a universal difference between Alariel and everyone else from that perspective. I do hope the Mistmage is going to give us campaign movement range, and that's a whole discussion on Sea Warfare on that subject. But yeah, victory conditions, Legendary Lord rebalancing, pacing issues, buildings, tech tree, economic buildings. Those are the kind of major issues I would hope Creative Assembly addresses for the High Elves. That's all I had to say. Christine signing out. Let me know what you guys think about this, what you guys would like to see addressed about the High Elves. What do you think is important for Creative Assembly to address for them? Stay tuned for more.